that there was a secret affair here, that Richard III had no Plantagenet blood, and that one of his ancestors between Richard and Edward.
History books have lied to you. They told you King Richard III was a villain who stole the crown. But a skeleton found under a parking lot in England just told a very different story. Scientists drilled into the bones of the last medieval king expecting to confirm his identity. They found a match on his mother's side perfectly, but when they looked at the male line, the results were impossible.
There is this break somewhere in these generations.
There is a break in the royal chain that nobody can explain. This changes 500 years of history. And the scary part is, it means the current royal family might not be royal at all. The discovery that broke the internet. It sounds like a joke, but it is actually the truth. The last Plantagenet King of England was not found in a cathedral or a grand tomb or a hidden crypt covered in gold. He was found under a municipal parking lot in a city called Leicester. For years, people parked their cars over a letter R painted on the asphalt, having no idea that just a few feet beneath their tires lay the most controversial king in English history. But here is the catch. The discovery was not an accident. It was the result of one woman's absolute obsession. Philippa Langley, a screenwriter and historian, had a feeling, literally a physical feeling, that the king was there. She walked into that parking lot years before the dig and felt a strange chill. She said she knew he was there. Everyone told her she was crazy. They said the king's body had been thrown into the River Soar centuries ago. They said the grave was lost forever. But she didn't listen. She raised the money, she got the University of Leicester involved, and in August 2012, they started digging. And get this. On the very first day, in the very first trench they dug, the backhoe bucket hit something. It was a human leg bone. It was almost too easy. They had to stop the machines and carefully brush away the dirt with small tools. Slowly, a skeleton emerged from the clay. It was a man, but he was in bad shape. The skull had been smashed open by a halberd, a massive axe-like weapon used in medieval warfare. The spine was twisted in a severe curve, proving that the stories about Richard's scoliosis were real, even if Shakespeare exaggerated them into a hunchback. The hands were crossed over the front, suggesting they had been tied. This was not a respectful burial. This was a body dumped in a hole that was too short for it. The atmosphere in the tent was electric. They knew they had found someone important, but finding a skeleton is one thing. Proving it is the King of England is something else entirely. This is where the science comes in, and this is where the story gets wild. To prove this was Richard, they needed DNA. Now, DNA degrades over time. It breaks down. But inside the dense bone of the inner ear, or the teeth, genetic material can survive for thousands of years. The scientists drilled into the bone, extracted the powder, and began the process of sequencing the genome. They needed a reference. You can't just look at DNA and see a name tag. You need a living relative to compare it to. They started with the easy part, mitochondrial DNA. This is the DNA passed from a mother to her children. It is very stable. It doesn't change much over generations. They traced a direct female line from Richard's sister, Anne of York, all the way down to a man named Michael Ibsen. Michael was a furniture maker living in London. He had no idea he was royalty. When the scientists swabbed his mouth and compared his DNA to the skeleton in the parking lot, it was a perfect match. The mitochondrial DNA was identical. It was a slam dunk. The skeleton was Richard III. The world went crazy. It was the biggest archaeological find of the century. They were ready to rewrite the textbooks. They were ready to give Richard the funeral he never had, but then they decided to do one more test. And that's putting it lightly. This test was the one that would open a can of worms that nobody can close. They decided to test the Y-chromosome. The Y-chromosome is passed from father to son. It follows the male line. Since Richard III was a Plantagenet, his Y-chromosome should match other male Plantagenet descendants. The team found living relatives who descended directly from the same male line, the family of the Duke of Beaufort. These men traced their lineage back to Edward III, just like Richard did. If the history books were right, the Y-chromosome should be the same. It should be a simple confirmation, a rubber stamp. But when the results came back from the lab, the scientists stared at the data in silence. The graphs didn't align. The markers were wrong. The Y chromosome from the king in the car park looked nothing like the Y chromosome of the living relatives. It didn't match. Do you realize what that means? It means that somewhere in the royal family tree, somewhere in those 19 generations between King Edward III and the modern day, there is a break. A father was not the real father. A mother had a secret affair. A child was born who carried the name of a king but the blood of a commoner. This is what scientists call a non-paternity event. In the regular world, it's a family drama. In the world of kings and queens, it's a catastrophe. It means the divine right of kings, the idea that God chose these people to rule by blood, is physically, biologically false. The discovery in the parking lot didn't just solve a missing person case, it accidentally pulled the thread that unravels the entire tapestry of the British monarchy. But what this mismatch actually reveals is darker than anyone imagined, and it points to a specific queen who changed history in a hotel room in France. Tracing the scandal through the centuries. To really understand why this DNA failure is such a massive deal, we have to look at how the royal system works. It's all about the male line, primogeniture. The crown passes from father to son. If you break that chain, the legitimacy vanishes. So let's break down the science. Every man gets a Y chromosome from his father. It's almost like a photocopy. It changes very, very slowly over thousands of years. This means that Richard III, who died in 1485, and his distant cousins alive today should share the same genetic signature. They both descend from King Edward III. The scientists tested 5 men from the Somerset family. These are the descendants of the Dukes of Beaufort. On paper, their family tree is perfect. It goes back father to son, all the way to the medieval kings. But the DNA said access denied. The mismatch was absolute. There was no way the skeleton in the car park in the Somerset family shared the same male ancestor in the time frame of the Plantagenets. Now you might be thinking, so what? Maybe the Somerset family is the one that's illegitimate. And you would be right to ask that. In fact, that is the safe theory. It's possible that one of the Dukes of Beaufort's wives had an affair in the 1700s or 1800s. If that happened, it's embarrassing for them, but it doesn't change the history of the throne. But here is the catch. The researchers didn't just find one mismatch, they looked deeper. They found that the rate of false paternity in these types of aristocratic families is estimated at about 1% to 2% per generation. Over 19 generations, the odds of a break are actually quite high. But what if the break happened before the Tudors? What if the break happened way back at the beginning? This is where the suppressed feeling of the report comes in. The scientists were very careful not to point fingers at specific people. They used codes and anonymous samples. But historians looked at the data and realized the break could easily be in the line of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was the son of Edward III. He was the ancestor of the Lancaster kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. He was also the ancestor of the Tudor claim. Henry VII claimed the throne because his mother was a descendant of John of Gaunt. If John of Gaunt was illegitimate, if his father was not the king, then the entire House of Lancaster was a fraud. Henry V, the hero of Agincourt, fraud. The Tudors, frauds. The DNA evidence suggests that the Y chromosome of the royal family has been swapped out at least once, and possibly multiple times. And get this, there was another test done on a man named Patrice de Warenne. He traces his male line back to the Plantagenets through an illegitimate son of Geoffrey of Anjou, who was the father of the very first Plantagenet king. If the official story is true, Patrice de Warenne should match Richard III and the Somersets. Guess what? He matched neither of them. This implies there isn't just one affair. There are multiple affairs. The royal bloodline is more like a Swiss cheese than a solid iron chain. It is full of holes. But the most explosive theory, the one that really shakes the foundations of history, isn't about the Somerset line. It's about Richard's own brother, King Edward IV. If the break in the DNA happened with Edward IV, then Richard III wasn't a usurper. He wasn't a villain stealing the throne from his nephews. He was the only legitimate heir attempting to save the crown from a bastard line. Think about the implications. We have spent 500 years reading Shakespeare, watching movies, and learning in school that Richard was evil because he declared his brother's marriage invalid. We thought it was a political lie, but the DNA suggests that Richard might have known something we didn't. He might have known that his brother didn't share his father's blood. The science is cold and unfeeling. It doesn't care about legends. It just tells us that someone, somewhere, lied about who was in their bed. And because of that lie, wars were fought, heads were chopped off, and the wrong people might have been wearing the crown for centuries. The suppressed section that people talk about online usually refers to the specific lack of detail regarding the living relative's paternity. The study protected their identities, but in doing so, it left the door open for wild speculation. And the wildest speculation of all involves a tall, blonde king and a short, dark duke. This is not just about a family drama. This is about the fundamental justification for war. In the Middle Ages, you only fought a war if you believed God was on your side because of your blood. If the blood is fake, the war is a crime. Imagine the Battle of Bosworth Field. You have Henry Tudor on one side and Richard III on the other. They are both claiming to be the true king. If the DNA theory is right, neither of them might have been the pure heir in the way they thought. Or worse, Richard was the only real one and he was slaughtered by a man with no claim at all. The researchers at Leicester were shocked because the probability of finding a break was there, but finding a break that could potentially invalidate the current monarchy was a nightmare scenario. They had to publish the results carefully. They had to say evidence of a non-paternity event instead of the Queen cheated. But the internet knows how to read between the lines. And the evidence for this specific affair isn't just in the DNA, it was written down by people who were in the room when it happened. The scandal that justifies Richard III. This is the part of the story where we have to become detectives. We have the DNA mismatch. Now we need a suspect. And all eyes are turning to Cecily Neville, the mother of both Edward IV and Richard III. Cecily was the Duchess of York. She was beautiful, powerful, and known as the Rose of Raby. She was married to Richard, the Duke of York. Now, the Duke was a very specific-looking guy. Descriptions from the time say he was short, stocky, and had dark features. Richard III, the skeleton in the car park, matches this description. He was slight, slender, and the facial reconstruction shows he had delicate features. But his older brother, King Edward IV, he was a giant. Edward IV was 6 feet 4 inches tall. In the 1400s, that is like being 7 feet tall today. He was a tower of a man. He was also incredibly handsome and had blonde hair. He looked absolutely nothing like his father, the Duke of York. He didn't look like his brother Richard, he looked like a different species. For centuries, people whispered that this was suspicious. But now we have the Blaeborn theory. Here is the timeline. Edward IV was born in April 1442. If you count back 9 months, conception would have happened in July or August of 1441. Where was the Duke of York in July 1441? He was on a military campaign in Pontoise, France. He was fighting the French. Where was his wife, Cecily? She was in Rouen, about 100 miles away. In the Middle Ages, 100 miles is a long way. It's a multi-day trip through war zones. Records show the Duke did not return to Rouen during those critical weeks. So, who was in Rouen with Cecily? Rumors from the time, rumors that were actually brought up in Parliament later on, claimed that Cecily was having an affair with a local archer named Blaeborn. An archer, a common soldier. If this is true, it explains everything. It explains why Edward was a blonde giant, maybe Blaeborn was tall and blonde. It explains why Edward was christened in a small private ceremony in a side chapel, while his younger brother Edmund was christened in a massive public ceremony in the cathedral. It was almost like they were trying to hide Edward's arrival. If Edward IV was the son of an archer, he was illegitimate. In English law, he could not be king. This changes the entire narrative of Richard III. When Richard took the throne in 1483, he claimed that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was illegal, which it was because Edward was already engaged to someone else. But there were also whispers that Richard knew the truth about his brother's birth. Imagine being Richard. You are the loyal son. You look like your father, you fight for your father, and you watch your older brother, who looks nothing like the family, take the crown and then hand power over to his wife's greedy relatives. Richard wasn't stealing the crown from his nephews, the princes in the Tower. He was taking it back for the House of York because he was the only true son of the Duke. The DNA mismatch supports this theory perfectly. If the Y-chromosome break happened at Edward IV, then the current line of the Somersets, who descend from the male line of Edward III, and the line of Richard III would be different. And they are. This also means that the princes in the Tower, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, were not royal princes. They were the grandsons of an archer. This leads to a wild revisionist theory. Did Richard really eliminate them? If they were illegitimate, they were no threat to him legally. He had Parliament declare them bastards, the titulus regius. He didn't need to murder them. Some historians now think the princes were moved or died of natural causes, or were simply written out of history by the Tudors who came later. But the Archer theory does more than just clear Richard's name. It effectively destroys the legitimacy of the entire dynasty that followed. Elizabeth of York, Edward's daughter, married Henry VII. She was the genetic link that gave the Tudors their credibility. If her father was a fake, she was a fake. And if she was a fake, then Henry VIII was the son of a usurper and the grandson of a commoner. The entire golden age of Elizabeth I was built on a genetic lie. The irony is unbelievable. The British aristocracy was obsessed with blue blood and pure breeding. They married cousins to keep the bloodline pure. But the DNA suggests that the most famous king of the era was actually half commoner, fathered by a soldier while the Duke was away at war. The suppression of this theory is not because it is impossible, but because it is too plausible. It fits all the facts. It explains the height difference. It explains the secrecy. It explains the DNA mismatch. But if Edward was illegitimate, the line of succession should have gone somewhere else entirely. It should have gone to the next legitimate brother. And if that brother is gone, it keeps moving down the family tree until it lands on someone alive today. This is where the story gets really weird. It moves from a history lesson to a modern-day investigation into a man who lived on the other side of the world. But if the current royal family descends from this fake line, does that mean there is a real king somewhere else? Why the Windsors might be frauds. This is where the story turns into a real-life version of a mystery novel. If Edward IV was illegitimate and his children were illegitimate, then who should have been king after Richard III died? The line of succession would have gone to the next legitimate brother. That was George, Duke of Clarence. Now George was executed for treason, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, according to legend. But he had children, and those children had children, and that line continued quietly through the centuries. They didn't have the crown, but they had the blood. A few years before the skeleton was found, a historian named Dr. Michael Jones tracked this bloodline down. He followed the family tree of the Duke of Clarence generation by generation. He went through earls and lords and ladies until he arrived at the most senior living descendant in the 21st century. He didn't find him in a palace. He didn't find him in a castle. He found him in Geraldry, Australia. His name was Michael Abney-Hastings. He was a rice farmer. He was the 14th Earl of Loudon, but he didn't use the title. He was just Mike to his neighbors. He drove a tractor, he served on the local council, and he was a committed Republican who didn't even believe in the monarchy. But if you apply the strict laws of medieval inheritance, and if you accept the theory that Edward IV was illegitimate, Michael Abney-Hastings was King Michael I of England. When a documentary crew told him this, he laughed. He said, "I reckon I might send Lizzie a bill for back rent." He thought it was funny, but historically it is deadly serious. If the Yorkist line had remained pure and if the Archer affair hadn't happened, the House of Windsor would not be on the throne. Queen Elizabeth II and now King Charles III trace their claim through the Tudor line, which connects to Edward IV's daughter. If that connection is severed by illegitimacy, their claim collapses. Michael Abney-Hastings died in 2012, ironically the same year Richard III was found. His son, Simon Abney-Hastings, is now the rightful king according to this theory. He lives in Victoria, Australia. He works in a fabric business. He isn't planning an invasion of England anytime soon, but his existence proves how fragile the concept of monarchy really is. And it's not just about the real king, it's about the Republic of Britain theory. There's a growing number of people who look at this DNA evidence and say, if the bloodline is fake, why do we have a monarchy? The whole point of the institution is the mystical connection to the past, the continuity. But the DNA in the car park broke that continuity. The discovery of the Y-chromosome break also brings up the curse of the usurper. There is a wild theory that the reason the royal family has had so much drama, from Henry VIII's beheadings to the madness of King George to the modern scandals, is because the line is cursed by its own illegitimacy. They are trying to hold on to a power that isn't biologically theirs. Of course, the modern monarchy operates on acts of parliament, not just biology. The Act of Settlement in 1701 basically said, we don't care about the past, this family is the royal family now. So legally, King Charles is safe. The police aren't going to evict him. But the suppressed feeling of the DNA report feeds into this. The establishment does not want to talk about Michael Abney-Hastings. They don't want to talk about the break in the Y chromosome. They want to focus on Richard's funeral and his curved spine. They want to bury the scandal along with the bones. But you can't unknow this. Once you realize that the man on the tractor in Australia had a better blood claim to the throne than the woman in Buckingham Palace, you can never look at the royal family the same way again. It exposes the whole system as a game of chance, winning wars and hiding secrets. And that's putting it lightly. The implications go beyond England. The British monarch was the head of an empire. If the line was broken in 1441, then every single colony, every single law signed in the name of the crown was technically signed by a fraud. This is the kind of stuff that historians whisper about at conferences but rarely put in textbooks. It makes history look like a series of accidents rather than a grand plan. The Australian king theory is the ultimate proof that biology and power are two different things. Mike Abney-Hastings lived a happy life without a crown. Richard III died a violent death fighting for one. In the end, maybe the rice farmer was the lucky one. But there is one more thing the DNA told us. It didn't just tell us who Richard was related to, it told us what he looked like. And that revelation is the final nail in the coffin of the Tudor lies. But there was one final secret the bones revealed, something that changes not just who the king was, but what he looked like. A king reborn and a dynasty questioned. So we have a broken bloodline, a fake dynasty, and a rice farmer king. But what about Richard himself? What does this DNA discovery do for the man who was buried in the dirt? For 500 years, the Tudors controlled his image. They hired artists to paint over his portraits. They added shadows under his eyes. They made his shoulders look uneven. They turned him into a caricature of evil. Shakespeare wrote him as a bunchback toad with a withered arm. But the science fought back. Using the skull found in the dig, experts performed a forensic facial reconstruction. They used 3D scanning and muscle mapping. When they finished, they didn't see a monster. They saw a man. He had a pleasant face. He looked worried, perhaps, but noble. And the DNA told them exactly how to color him. The genes predicted he had blue eyes and blonde hair in childhood, which likely darkened to light brown as he aged. When they compared this reconstruction to the earliest surviving portrait of Richard, the arched frame portrait, it was a near-perfect match. It proved that the later portraits were propaganda. The Tudors literally photoshopped history with paintbrushes to make him look like a bad guy. This is the ultimate vindication. The DNA proved he wasn't a monster. The spine proved he had a disability but wasn't a cripple who couldn't fight. And the Y-chromosome mismatch proved that his seizure of the throne was likely motivated by a genuine belief that his brother was illegitimate. Richard III has been reburied in Leicester Cathedral. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch his coffin pass. It was the funeral of a king, 5 centuries late. But the report, the full implications of the DNA, remains a sensitive topic. You won't see the royal family issuing a press release about the Somerset line mismatch. You won't see history books immediately calling Henry VII a fraud. Institutions move slowly. They protect themselves. But the information is out there. We know now that the suppressed section isn't a redaction in a document. It's the silence of the historians who don't want to admit that the entire narrative of British history is built on a foundation of sand. The wild theories are becoming less wild every day. The idea that Edward IV was illegitimate is now considered a very strong probability by many serious researchers. The idea that the princes in the Tower survived is gaining traction because if they were bastards, they didn't need to die. So what do you think? Was the archer in the bedroom the real father of Edward IV? Is the current royal family ruling on a throne of lies? And does the existence of an Australian king make you question everything you learned in history class? Let me know in the comments below. This discovery is still unfolding, and who knows what else is buried under the parking lots of England. If you want more suppressed history and wild theories, hit that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.